Who here loves a really good story? Right? As soon as you know you're about to hear a good story, you kind of get settled in, don't you? You kind of sit back and you get all comfy, and if you're like me, you pull out the popcorn, and you're ready for a really good story. Because good stories are the stories that move us from reality. They take us away from our everyday, humdrum kind of life, and they move us into something bigger, something even larger, maybe even a deeper meaning to life. Think about the last really good story that you heard or read or saw. Maybe it was a winter book that you finished during the freezing days of January and February, or perhaps it was on the television where you saw a good story, or perhaps you moved into the modern day and you're looking at a YouTube channel where there's a story told, or perhaps even something called a podcast where you can listen to the story being read for you. Or if you're like me, a movie that tells a really good story that you don't know the end just simply by watching the first few moments in the beginning. So what do you think makes a really good story? For you, what makes a good story? A plot. That's a good one. It needs a plot. It needs to have a good storyline. What else makes a good story?
Actors. Good actors.
Good actors, yes. What makes a good story for you, Jim?
It has to have something interesting.
Something interesting to listen to. Absolutely. What else makes a really good story?
Some sort of problem.
A problem, yeah, something that needs to be solved, right? And all of these good, great parts about a really great story does something different for us. It stirs our emotions. It does something other than just informing us. It invites us into the story, where we can actually maybe see ourselves as part of the story, or wrestling with something in the story, that we need to question ourselves or the world around us. It really takes us out of just our everyday life. Now for me, I have a couple of favorite movies, and I like movies that have a twist that you don't see coming. And so I have a favorite movie. It was called The Village. I don't know if any of you saw it. It's a suspense kind of story, right? And when you get into this movie and you get to the end, you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. And I love when that happens. See, this movie is about what appears to be an Amish community. A group of people living, right off the land, without any of the materialistic parts of the world, and they're teaching their young ones how to be raised up into this community, and everybody's happy and everybody's healthy, except for one thing. You're not allowed to go out into the woods. That's the rule. No leaving the community, no going into the woods. Because in the woods lives a monster. And if you go into the woods, you'll be killed by the monster. And so this story has been told over and over through these different generations, from grandparents to parents and down to children. And all of that is fine until someone in the community one day gets sick. And they don't have the medicine to heal the person. And so now the trouble is, how do we get the medicine? Well, the elders know they can go to the next community and get the medicine, but no one has ever done that before. And so the elders vote and decide who is going to be the one that's going to leave the community, go through the forest, fight the monsters, and get to the next community and get the medicine and bring it back. And so they vote. And lo and behold, the young girl is raised up, and she's the one who's going to go. But the interesting thing is, she is blind. Now, how is she going to get through the woods and get to the next community and get the medicine? And as the story unfolds, we as the viewers of the movie, we begin to see what the people in the community do not. There really is no monsters in the woods. That was the elders. They would dress up at night and they would shout things and scream things to scare people in the town. Because actually on the other side of the woods was a great big wall. You see, the elders had decided that the world was too dangerous for their community. And so they built this big wall in a nature preserve, and they started their own community inside. And they lied to them day after day that there was no one else out there. And they knew if they could send someone out to get the medicine and come back, they could save the young's life, but they couldn't reveal the story. And so they sent a blind girl. Once she got to the edge of the forest, she came to the wall. She found the door and went out the door and went to the next community and got the medicine. But remember, she's blind. She never sees the truth. And for me, the biggest twist was the people in the community never learn the truth. They're never told exactly what's happening to them. And they live life in a lie. An even bigger twist to the entire movie is that it was written because of when America went to war with Iran. The man who wrote the movie felt like the people of America were being duped. They were being lied to. And they were being treated like that. At the end of the movie, I thought, isn't it interesting how I know people in their own lives who live like that every day? They're afraid to go beyond the forest. They're afraid to go beyond the walls because people have told them that they can't. Or that there is nothing else out there for them. That once they die, it's all over. And you and I, who know the truth, what lies beyond our doubts and our fears is our faith in Jesus. But they were never told that. I think about people who live like that every day of their lives. Because we haven't told them the truth. There's a man by the name of Jim Blastman, and Jim is a syndicated columnist. He writes articles for all sorts of different magazines and things. He has his own radio talk show, and he was talking about business and corporations and how they tell their stories to generations after generations. And I love this quote that he wrote in Forbes magazine. He wrote this. He said, "The holy grail of storytelling is when someone else tells your story to someone else." The holy grail of telling a really good story is telling the story of someone else to someone else. It reminds me of a great story that we read in scriptures about a woman at the well. Some of you may remember this story. We read about it in John's Gospel. Now, if you remember the story, there's a woman who comes to the watering well and she meets a man who's there. She's coming to get her water in the middle of the day, and she meets a man there, and they strike up a conversation. And before long, the man begins to tell the woman a story about her. He says, "Yes, I do know you. I know that you've had 5 ex-husbands, and you're currently living with a man who's not your husband." Well, the woman is completely astonished and amazed at this story that the man is telling her. And she says, "Listen, I see that you're a prophet. And I know that the Messiah is coming. We have been told story after story about the Messiah is coming." Jesus turns and he looks into her eyes and he says, "I am." He says, "I am the one who speaks with you." And in that moment of revelation of the plot twist that's happening in her head, you can just hear what she's thinking. And then she says, "Is this true? Could this be true? Could all the stories that I've been told throughout the years about the Messiah coming, is this now true? Are all the stories that have been told to me actually true?" And in her excitement, she rushes away from the well. She goes back into town with all those people who had shunned her for her life, and she begins to tell them, "Guess what happened to me? Guess who I met? Come," she says. "Come." And she invites everybody in the town who will listen to her to come back to the well. Come and meet a man who has told me everything that I have done. Come and meet him. Now, a lot of times our storytelling in church ends there with the woman at the well. But the story does not end there in the Gospel of John. It goes on. The townspeople actually come out to meet Jesus. They come out to the well and they begin to talk and banter back and forth and learn more about him. And they say, "Hey, Jesus, come into our town and stay with us. Come and have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Come and hang out by the fire. Come and have conversation with us. Come and see us and meet us, and we will meet you." And so for 2 days, Jesus goes into the town and talks and meets with these people. At the end of the 2 days, the people gather around the woman and they tell her this. They say, "We no longer believe because of what you said. We have now heard for ourselves. And now we believe. We know that this man Jesus is the Savior of the world." All because this woman goes back into town and tells the story about him. All because she goes back into town and says what? She says, "Come. Come meet this man who knows me better than anyone else. Come." And they do. And they go and they meet him. And because they meet him, their faith begins. The game changer is not that she went back into town. The game changer is not because of her history. The game changer is when they actually sit down with Jesus and they meet him face to face. What convinces them is Jesus' story about himself. A good story it's one that's not filled with personal pronouns. A good story is never all about me, myself, and I. No one wants to hear what you did and how this affected you, and no one, quite frankly, wants to see what you're eating for dinner, by the way. Good stories are stories told about other people to other people. Those are the stories that expand upon what we know to be true. Our word for today is the word evangelism. Now, last week, Pastor Tiffany had spoken to you about another word, selflessness, and she had said the same thing that I'm about to say. This is not a word that Jesus ever spoke, but it's a word that he lived each and every day. Evangelism means the commitment to act or publicly speak on behalf of the gospel. Now, for a lot of us, we think, oh, that's reserved for just a certain group of trained people. But to put it real simply, here's what evangelism means. It means describing a person or activity who tells the story. Storytelling. That's evangelism. The really neat thing about this word evangelism is there's no direct translation from our scripture into this word evangelism, but Jesus lives it every single day of his life because Jesus is the story. Is the story that we need to be telling. You know, the Apostle Peter, he gave a sermon on the day of Pentecost. We call it a sermon, he called it a message, and during his day it was just a gathering of people that he was speaking to. And they gather around and he tells them, listen, I have a story to tell you about a man. About a man whom I knew. A man whose credentials God proved to us. And God proved them through miracles and wonders and signs. And God performed all of these acts to prove him to us. Peter said, you know, even with all the evidence, even with the stories that Jesus told about himself, they all came true. And even then, he was still betrayed. And even then, we killed him. And for most of us, we would say that's the end of the story. We all know what happens when people die, right? They're dead. They decay in the grave. And it's all over. And the stories disappear. And their memories fade away. But Peter said, no, wait, hold on. There is a twist to this story. This is where the plot is really going to change. Because God raised him up. This man whose story was true and proven true was resurrected. And people saw him. My brother Matthew has a story. And he tells a story about this exact moment in time. We find it in the 27th chapter of Matthew. Matthew says, you know, there was this day. It was around noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a time when the skies went dark across the land. There was a man who was hanging on a cross, dying. He yelled out something to his God that he proclaimed. And when he yelled out, we all kind of stood around waiting to see if God would show up. You know, if God would actually come and save this guy hanging on the cross who claimed to be his son. But nothing happened. And then the guy hanging there on the cross, he said a few more words, and then we watched him die. But you know what? At the very same time this was happening on the hill, while that guy was hanging on the cross dying, back in the temple, there's this big curtain that we have hanging inside our temple. And on one side is where we're all allowed to be. That's where the priests and then the humans are allowed to be. And on the other side of the cross, that's where God lives. That's where the presence of God is. We used to call it the Holy of Holies. And as this man was dying on the cross, the minute that he died, we noticed that the curtain that was hanging in the temple was torn in two. And it tore apart. And at that moment, God was with us, and we were with God all together. But that's not all that happened. At the same time that he was dying, at the same time that the curtain in the temple was being torn in two, and that we were coming together with God, we all felt the earth shake. And when the earth began to shake, the graves began to open. And our friends and our family that we had buried before, they came up out of the graves. And they went into town and they were talking with people, and people saw them. Peter says, my brother Matthew has a story. And that story needs to be told. Because what happens next is the most amazing thing in the world. 3 days later, after we bury Jesus in a tomb, he raises up and he walks around and people saw him. This is just a simple story about a guy. A guy who walked and talked and preached and said that he would die one day and that he would be resurrected. But it is the foundation of our faith. It is why we're going to come together and celebrate Easter in such beautiful ways. The simple plot has a huge twist. It amazes all of us. But Peter says there's even more. This whole story about the resurrection of Jesus. Yes, he proclaimed it. Yes, it came true. Yes, we all saw it. But this story is really about us. We're invited. For those of us who believe and know in this story, we get the same gift. Eternal life. We get salvation. We get raised from the strongholds of death. Peter says, you know, I'm telling you all this story, but here's the twist. It's not about Jesus' resurrection. It's about yours. It's about yours. It's about salvation. This is evangelism. This is telling the story. A story that gets greater and greater every time we tell it. It's a story that we weave into our own story. It's a story that we tell how we were introduced to Jesus, how we discovered Jesus, how we were invited into his story. It's a story about how that knowing changed our lives. It's a story as to why we do what we do. It's a story that we show others how much we value their lives and how much they mean to us because they are a child of God. It drives what we do and what we say every day of our lives. You know, I can just imagine when Matthew is telling this story that's happening. And all that's happening on the hill and in the temple, and the ground is shaking. I can't help but think about all the other stories that are being told at the same time. I wonder what the woman at the well is saying that day. I wonder what story she's telling. I wonder what the blind man at the pool is saying the day that he hears that story? I wonder what the once demon-possessed little boy is saying when he hears the story of Jesus' resurrection. I wonder what happened to the little girl who was raised from the dead. What was her story that day? I wonder about the judge and the jury named Pilate. What was his story? I wonder about the family and the friends of a man named Judas. What was their story on that day? This is evangelism. This is what we are called to do. This is the story of Jesus. So what is the story I am going to tell? That's the question. Because if I tell a story that's filled with me, myself, and I, no one's listening. Again, no one cares what you're eating for dinner. But if you're going to tell a story about somebody else, to someone else, about what he said and what he represented and what he did and what he offers, and that they can receive that same offering, that is a great story. If you and I can tell a story about a man who told us he was going to die and he was going to be resurrected, and he does it, that is a great story with a great twist and an awesome invitation for us to not only receive, but then to give. So I wonder, what story are you telling as a follower of Jesus Christ?